Good evening and a very warm welcome to all. A special welcome to Ambassador Locson, Ambassador Jalali, Minister Fischer, and distinguished members of the Bundestag, and all of you, warm, good friends of the American Academy. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to this event, part of the Richard C. Holbrooke Forum of the American Academy. We are particularly pleased to have two outstanding guests with us who will discuss with us the current state of affairs on questions of security, threats to security, and alliances in the Atlantic sphere. It is an honor to welcome Steve Hadley as a distinguished visitor to the Hans Arnold Center, one of the preeminent practitioners of statecraft and diplomacy in the United States. Mr. Hadley served as National Security Advisor during President George W. Bush's second term in office between 2005 and 2009. Having previously served as Deputy National Security Advisor, and he looks back on a very distinguished career at the highest level of national security policymaking in Washington. He has served all Republican presidents since Gerald Ford, either on the National Security Council, the Pentagon, or on other special assignments. At the highest political level, friendship is a most interesting category. Interesting to philosophers from Aristotle and on, and interesting in practice, surprisingly so, I think, to many of the most interesting political actors. This is why we are tremendously pleased that Steve Hadley will be joined tonight by Christoph Heusgen, who has not just been a colleague and counterpart at the heights of policymaking, but who has also become one of his close friends. Christoph Heusgen has been, as all of you know, Chancellor Merkel's chief foreign policy advisor for the last 12 years. He entered the German Foreign Service in 1980, and as of this summer will return to the Auswärtiges Amt in his new capacity as the German ambassador to the United Nations. There is no doubt that he has been and remains one of the most influential diplomats the Bundesrepublik Deutschland has produced. Thank you both for joining us tonight. 22 years ago, Richard Holbrooke famously wrote that even after the end of the Cold War, America would be a European power. This was a strong statement of commitment at the time, but today, to many, this has become a questionable assertion with all the uncertainty that the current political moment raises. How will the partners across the Atlantic react to internal and external pressures and to the new uncertainty in the transatlantic dialogue and relationship? What are the challenges? What are the silver linings? Christoph Heusgen has agreed to steer us through the discussion and then to moderate the question and answer period that will follow the dialogue between our two honored guests. Finally, after the discussion has concluded between the two guests, you are invited to ask questions from the floor. A microphone will be passed around. We request that you introduce yourselves very briefly for the benefit of all of us, including those who are not fortunate enough to be in the room, but who will be watching, thanks to our colleagues, on the video now and later on. And then finally, as always, you are warmly invited to join us for a reception and some snacks and drinks next door, and especially on our terrace, where the sun may still be shining. Thank you all for being here. Welcome, and we turn the floor to our guests.
So, first of all, thank you very much, Steinberg, for inviting us here to the American Academy. It's a great pleasure to be here, and it's a great pleasure to be here together with Steve. We go back to 2005, at the end of 2005, when the Chancellor won the elections, and I became the foreign policy advisor, and one of the first calls at the time was with Steve, and I must say I learned a lot from you, and it was great fun working with you at the time. We went through many difficult decisions, which we won't get back to today, but we had a very, very good time together. What I appreciated at the time was how seriously you took transatlantic relations, both in terms of German-American relations, but also at the time already taking keen interest in having the Quint and having the European countries also involved and having this transatlantic relationship work well on this level. There's That was always fun to work with you. There was one thing why I didn't admire you, that was on your daily schedule, because Steve at the latest was in the office at 4:30.
5:30.
5:30. Okay.
Wasn't that bad.
5:30 to get ready the reports overnight, the security briefing for the president, because the president, I don't know, went to bed very early, which is good, but also got up very early, right? So that was a few years ago. We are back here with a new president who certainly poses challenges, I think, back home in the US, but also to the partners. And why don't we get in the middle of it? What do you think is going to happen in an hour or so, when the president is scheduled to decide what he will do on the climate change?
So I need to begin. One, it's terrific for me to be here with Christoph. He was a fabulous colleague. And in the areas when we disagreed, I'm sad to say, history usually proved that he was right and I was wrong. So I learned that early on, and therefore put increasing weight on what he would advise. But we had a wonderful relationship, partly because the chancellor and President Bush had a wonderful relationship. She had a wonderful facility to figure out these old guys and figure out how to manage them. And you know, it's a tribute to her. She was both the best friend of George W. Bush and the best friend of Barack Obama, and they're not that similar, those two guys. So I'm hopeful that she will work a similar constructive relationship with President Trump, because I think she can be enormously helpful to him. The other thing I have to say is that I was not part of the Trump campaign. I was not part of the Trump transition. I am not and will not be part of the Trump administration. And I have never met Donald Trump. So you can decide how much weight you should give to my predictions. And another problem is that 2 nights ago I said, well, I thought actually he'll stay in the climate change agreement, the Paris Climate Accord, but will drop the targets. Having read the papers today, I think I'm going to be proved wrong. I think, look, he has said a lot of things in the campaign that were part of why he got elected, and he's a smart politician. He knows he has to take care of his base. And I think climate change is an issue for the base. In some sense, the same way trade is. Climate change is actually not very popular in the United States. You know, I have to remind people that one of the first things President George W. Bush did was to get out of the Kyoto Protocol, which caused great consternation in Europe. So I now think that probably chances are better than even that he's going to give this one to the base, and he will pull out of the Paris Climate Accord. I say that with not any great satisfaction. I think that's unfortunate. And I think it'll just feed a lot of narratives about this president. I think it'll compound the problems that surface from some missteps that the press heavily focused on during the trip here. The thing I would, and I'm no climate change specialist, but I'm not sure it's going to really have that much impact on climate change. And I'll tell you why. So, as I understand it, and again, I'm no expert, the commitment the United States made was by 2025, we will have reduced CO2 emission levels from 2005 by 26 to 28%. And the latest figures I'm aware of is that by 2015, we're already down 12%. Not really because of government policy, but because of the market. It turns out, you know, natural gas is cheaper than coal, so power plants in the United States are moving from coal to natural gas, and that brings down emission levels. And I think that will probably continue. Second, states have a lot to do with climate policy. And as Joschka Fischer said, and I think he's right, if President Trump gets out of the Paris Accords, it will probably provoke a big debate within the United States. And you're going to have states like California moving ahead aggressively on climate legislation. And if they, for example, set vehicle emission levels, all of U.S. car manufacturers will have to follow them because you can't afford to be locked out of the California market. So I think it'll be a big issue, but I'm not sure in the end of the day it's going to have a huge impact on what happens in terms of climate change. And the last thing I would say is even if the president announces he wants to get out, as I read the reports in the press, it's 3 years before he can effectively, at least 3 years before he can effectively leave the agreement. And the latest thing I saw means it's November 2020. Another year for a presidential election. And we don't know what that will be. So I guess I would say to folks, like I say generally, have some strategic patience with this new administration. We have a president who's never served in government before at any level. He's learning on the job. He's going to do some things you like. He's going to do some things you don't like. But I would urge people not to overreact, even to his tweets. And we can talk about his tweets later. But on this one, I think it may not have as dramatic impact as you would think from the current press.
Yes,
what's your thought?
Well, I expect exactly that this happens. There was a very intense debate during the G7 where the G6, so to speak, made the point to the president why the Paris Agreement is so important for reasons of the environment, for reasons of what message do you send to African countries, what messages do you send to small islands, also what message do you send in the question of global leadership.
Right.
Will now that the US is leaving Paris on a very important question, which is climate, all of a sudden you will have other players on the world take the leadership. And you could also see that early on in the administration when the question of free trade was up for grabs, then all of a sudden, as unlikely as this sounds, all of a sudden the Chinese president claimed he is now the defender of free trade when he was in Davos. So I mean, these are, of course, repercussions that maybe on climate as such. By 2020, you may have a new president who will say, by the way, we're going to enter Paris, and because of the states, like California and others, you have been following actually
right.
the reduction as but then another president will say, okay, I'll follow it, but the damage that potentially is be done by that. So I see that as one of the fallouts. Let's go back to Steve. Let's go back to your work as a national security advisor. I remember when we worked together that actually when you talk to one in the White House or even at the time in the State Department, you would more or less get the same response. Now, my impression today, the White House works differently. It depends now to whom you talk, what kind of answer do you get. So what is your interpretation, and do you think this can work, and how should we deal with that?
Well, again, I'm not part of this White House. One of the things, though, is Christoph, and it's important, again, I'm all about context. Christoph came in 2005. 2005 now is the second term of the Bush administration. And one of the things that we learn in political science, we'll talk to you about, a first-term president is very different than a second-term president. Because by the second term, the president has met every world leader many times, has been through at least 2 or 3 crises, and knows what he or she believes, and really has some policy set, and the procedures are pretty well down. So you came in on the sort of 4th and a half year of our administration. The Trump administration has been in power less than 4.5 months. And it came in as a political insurgency and a populist movement that most of the policies over the last 2 decades were a mistake and that the elites in the country had betrayed the American people. So they came in on a sort of throw the guys out kind of, and with people, including the president, with not a lot of government experience. So you can expect there's going to be a lot of on-the-job training and on-the-job learning. They brought in a White House that has a variety of power centers. You know all of them. There's the Bannon faction, which is the keeper of the commitments in the campaign. There's a chief of staff function. It's not clear how far the chief of staff's writ runs. There's the vice president. There's the NSC. There's the Economic Council. And then there's the family, Jared and Ivanka. Lots of different voices to this president, and he likes it. That's clearly part of his management style. FDR had the same kind of management style. And it's problematic in a White House where you try to have policies, clear messages, and systematic execution. And they're having a lot of problems. And the president knows it. The president knows it, and that's why he came back from this trip and said he's going to make some changes. I think he has to make some changes. The Clinton administration in its early years started in the same way until Leon Panetta came in and established some order. The question really that I think we have to follow closely is what happens in this shakeout? Does he actually streamline the process and empower some people to run it? Some people are going to lose their jobs. I mean, Trump is pretty comfortable firing people when things aren't working. He went, yes, right, we all know that. He went through 3 campaign teams. You know, he's going to throw people out until he gets a group of people that's supportive in the way. Who loses their job and who is brought in? Is it traditionalists that are brought in, or is it traditionals that lose and some of the people from the campaign are brought in? That's going to tell us something about what the president concludes he needs because he's not having enough. And I don't know well enough to predict which is going to happen. But I think there will be some changes. I think the president knows it's not working for him. He's going to change it. And he may change it again before he gets it done. So this transition to the new administration, which usually takes 6 or 8 months, in the case of this kind of administration, given how they came into power, really the first time in modern times when you've had a populist movement win the White House, it's going to take a year before we really know how this administration is going to operate.
Of course, the problem is that this is all logic, and we'll follow this. I must say also, I have already my second counterpart after General Flynn, and I must say, General McMaster, I can only say positive things about him, his experience and his openness to Europe. But while they are testing on the ground and doing the match, what happens with transatlantic relations? The fallout of Trump election, and also now you follow in the European media that every move by the president is noticed, and whenever he tweets something or whenever he does something, a little gesture or something, this is all maybe sometimes blown out of proportion, but contributes to a picture where, well, maybe the US is not, as the British president is not very reliable, and so you get more and more questions about the value of transatlantic relations, and don't we need to reorient our policy? So so while we have to have strategic patience, not everybody has that, and understandably so, and there may be some consequences out of this. So what is your advice on that, or what is your view on this?
Well, you're absolutely right, of course. The world will not the world does not have strategic patience generally. It doesn't have much patience at all, and events will still happen. And the worry I have, you always worry about a crisis early in a first year of an administration when it doesn't have its people, processes, and policies in place. And I think we're particularly susceptible because of the slowness with which this administration's gotten itself together. So that's certainly right. Secondly, I guess if if President Trump were here, and if I had courage, I would say something like this. You know, he is a transaction guy, and he's always negotiating. And you saw this on the transatlantic relationship. He said the allies need to do more, pay more for defense, and NATO needs to focus more on countering terrorism. And NATO allies now are talking about doing more to reach the 2% goal, and Secretary General is talking more about fighting terror. And so Trump would say, see, it worked. I'm getting results. And that's true in some measure, but the point Christoph is making is your rhetoric matters, and it can have political repercussions that can change the context in a way that defeats your policy. I think the president thinks, you know, in the end of the day, he takes a negotiating posture, you know, puts pressure on the other side. He gets an agreement, everybody comes together, and everything's fine. And it may not be fine. And the one that George Shultz was at a conference I was on and asked a very important question. The one he pointed to was Mexico. Mm-hmm. It may be that in the end of the day, we'll work out something to better control the border, and we'll renegotiate NAFTA that the Mexicans, the Canadians, the Americans will like, and there'll be a photo opportunity on the White House lawn. But in the meantime, unfortunately, the rhetoric President Trump has used about Mexican immigration and about the impact of trade policies on American jobs is changing the political atmosphere in Mexico and may contribute to the election of somebody like López Obrador as president of Mexico. And he has a very different agenda. And if that happens, it may be much more difficult to reach an understanding with Mexico. So it's one of the things that I hope this president will learn, and we can talk a little bit about how that applies to the European section. But what I would say to him is, watch the rhetoric, because it can change the political reality that in turn can change your and impair your ability to achieve the objectives of your policy for which you're engaging in the negotiations. I don't think he's got that left. You know, when you do transactions, you do a deal with somebody, you close the deal, you may never see that person again. But, you know, if you're president of the United States, you're going to be dealing with these people for 4 or 8 years. And it's a different deal. Different deal.
Yeah. No, I don't know Mexico well enough, but having spoken to some Mexican who are very proud people, the way that the president has spoken about them, of course, has created some apprehension, and maybe this may be an outcome. We hope that this will not happen, that populists will not win. And let me try to, from Mexico, to turn a bit to Europe and the fallout in Europe. Now, I cannot prove it, but of course we had in Europe, from our perspective, 2 major events that everybody was surprised. First, Brexit, and second, then the Trump election, which I think here everybody, if we would do a poll here, I would say 95% would say, well, we would not have voted for President Trump. Maybe
let's do that. Now. How many people predicted Trump would win? Now, see, this is interesting. Look at this. We got some. Well, you were right.
The ambassador was right.
Really?
Yep.
Interesting.
Yeah. Now, the fallout in Europe, it may be too early to say this, but we had some elections here where people thought they could turn wrong. I mean, the Austrian presidential elections, we had the Dutch elections, we had the French elections, and while of course in all these countries the populists are still fairly strong and far too strong, nevertheless the moderates won. And what could be a fallout of this is that in Europe, Europe say, okay, things are getting serious. We have problems getting closer to Europe. The crisis in the Middle East, the refugees, situation in Libya, Ukraine is right next door, and now we see that we cannot sit back anymore and have the Americans solve all the problems for us. So maybe, and this is our hope, that of course this is a lesson for the Europeans, that we have to get our act together and assume more responsibility. Now, I think that the elections of Macron is a very positive signal, that Macron, who is a very experienced, even at a young age, a very experienced politician, a very knowledgeable person, very determined. When you look through his CV and also from the way how he got from an advisor to an economic minister, having his agenda, was not able to carry it through as an advisor, as a minister, and said, okay, if I cannot get it through, I become president myself. Everybody thought, you know, how crazy can you be? But he succeeded. He had some luck. He succeeded. So he's very determined. He is very determined to reform France, and then, you know, on eye level with Germany to move Europe forward. So maybe this can, for us, can have some positive positive momentum. And now, I mean, we have always been able to shoot ourselves in the foot, but I think there is a certain chance on Europe that we move forward. I don't know how you see transatlantic relations and what you suggest we should do now as a consequence of Trump and the presidency with so many question marks.
So let's do two things. I'll answer that question, and then I'll put one to you on Europe, if I can. So look, President Trump's just been on a trip. The trip to Saudi and Israel and the West Bank was kind of spring-loaded to succeed. Those countries were desperate to have a different kind of relationship with President Trump than they felt they had with President Obama, rightly or wrongly. That's how they felt. And they were bound and determined that it was going to be a success, and it was. The climate coming to Europe was very different. And I think, in some sense, both the U.S. press and the European press were looking to highlight differences, and particularly to take advantage of any missteps that President Trump made. I read, for example, the speech he gave at NATO, which everybody said did not reaffirm the Article 5 commitment. That is, attack on one is an attack on all. Well, that was an event to celebrate Article 5 and NATO's invocation of Article 5 after the 9/11 attack on the United States. That was the purpose, or one of the two purposes, of the event. So, the president's appearance there, I would have thought, was an indication of his support for Article 5. And that he did, and if I had been advising him, I would have said, you don't need to reaffirm the commitment to Article 5. Everybody sees it because you're standing there celebrating its invocation. In retrospect, 2020 hindsight, if anyone would have advised him, put it in, reaffirm Article 5. But the fact that he didn't, I don't think should raise any doubts in anybody's mind about this administration's and the American people's continued commitment to NATO and to Article 5. And I read the speech. It is pointed and direct about the allies needing to do more in terms of defense. American political leaders and officials have been saying that for 20 years. So I think a lot of this is overblown. I will say, though, that I thought your chancellor got it right. She said, we, Germany, and I, the chancellor, am committed to the transatlantic relationship, committed to good relationships with the UK, even though they voted for Brexit. I'm committed with good relationship with the United States, even though I have some concerns with what I heard from President Trump at the G7. That said, Europe needs to do more and take more responsibility for its own future. And I think I agree with that. I think you agree with that. Chancellor Merkel said it, and Donald Trump would agree with it. And I think that's really an opportunity. So I would not overreact to what you heard in the press on that. My question for Christoph is this one. And this has all gotten serious. He's a funny guy, as you can see, and I'm a very serious guy, so the jokes are going to have to come from him. But, Donald Trump was elected because there are a big chunk of Americans who feel victimized by globalization, threatened by immigration, and abandoned by the politics and by the elite. And, you know, they're right. And one of the things that's been interesting living in Washington and being part of the Washington establishment is that in the wake of his election, to hear Democrats and Republicans in foreign policy saying, you know, there's a lot of truth to that. This rules-based international order hasn't quite served all Americans the way it should have. So there was a corrective there. And I think it's that same frustration that resulted in Brexit and gave us a scare in the French vote and in the Dutch vote, and needs to be addressed. And my worry on behalf of Europe is people will say, well, you know, Trump has sort of taken the Americans out of the play and the Brits have taken themselves out of the play. It's full speed ahead on the EU as currently configured. And I think that would be a mistake, because my own sense is the EU project was never sold to the European publics. It was always an elite enterprise. There are really rumblings of unhappiness, and you saw it in concerns about immigration. And my question is this an opportunity really to downscope in some sense the aspirations for the EU, recommit to it, and then really take it to the people of Europe and get them to commit to it? There may be a real opportunity here, and if it's going to happen, the only politician I know on Europe who could do that would be Angela Merkel, and she now has a potential partner in Macron. So question is whether there's a real opportunity here for Europe.
Well, on your analysis, I will share it, but I don't completely share it. I don't completely share it because the European movement, the European idea, was an idea after the Second World War, and in the 50s and 60s and 70s was an idea that was actually a mainstream idea. You would have, 80, 90, 100% people in favor, the people who lived through the Second World War, who lived through the post-war period, who then witnessed how all of a sudden Europe was working together again, economic union, you had the borders come down, you had the possibility to travel, you had then currency, although that was already debated, but the possibility to study wherever you want, and when you look at the numbers of people studying in other universities in Europe, it's just amazing. What I think the political class underestimated was that while the political class always knows this and says, isn't this fantastic that we have this, the normal people took this for granted and said, this is how it is. And so they take it for granted, and then they look at what are new challenges or other challenges, what are challenges coming from globalization. And there, you are right, they thought that Europe didn't have the response ready for it. So, and this is where this frustration came. We have it in East European countries. I mean, they were they came out of communism, and one thing they wanted is join the European Union, join NATO. And once they had joined it, all of a sudden, they have reached it, they take it for granted, and all of a sudden old problems come up, challenges come up, nationalism comes up, which was subdued, which was, and we have to cope with this, and the populist stream. So we have to respond to this. We saw this, of course, in connection with the refugee crisis, and while there's a lot of criticism within our countries, the dimension of the objection to just taking a handful of refugees in East European countries and the opposition to this and the very militant opposition to it was something that many of us were surprised by. So that this lack of solidarity in such of a question. So this, if you witness that, you doubt a bit, will this Europe ever work again? But coming back to what I said before, I think that this populism, Brexit, Trump, we have a chance right now. We have a chance for, as you said, for Macron and the chancellor, for this Europe, for many people getting second thoughts and thinking, where are we going? But what we have to do, there are a few things. One thing is, which I don't have a solution for, is the bureaucracy of Brussels. One of the huge problems we have in the European Union is that the Brussels institutions are perfect. They manage the European Union. The problem is that the people in Brussels are, to a certain degree, to a large degree, totally detached from reality in member states. So they are perfect bureaucrats. They know all the regulations and they want to implement those. So one of the things when Joschka Fischer was foreign minister at the time, not that he threw me out, but I left him and I went to Brussels and worked for Javier Solana to try to build the External Action Service at the time. What was key there was to say, and the Action Service is until today built on this, on a rotational system. You have member states diplomats who go there for a few years and then at a certain stage come back, and so they take memberships, they feel close to the member state, and then they'll bring this to Brussels and take Brussels opinions here. But the largest part are just civil servants who love their salary, who sit there and don't reflect back what the citizen wants. So this is a huge problem, and I don't know how to resolve that. Within Europe, and this is we had the, what was it, the 60th anniversary of the Treaty of Rome. They had in Rome the summit where the leaders said we have to take into consideration what you said. We have to concentrate on those issues where people feel most concerned about. What is this? Interior security. So we have to work so that the people in Europe feel secure, that while we all believe the Schengen, to have open borders is fantastic, but to keep these open, we have to be sure that we protect the outer borders. And this is a project that everybody will agree to do. Foreign policy and security policy, something where people also say, yes, there's an advantage if Europe works together. And so this is the next project where we have to work right now, where the French are very open to work on this, and this will be the second project. And then the third project is the Economic and Monetary Union. We hope that President Macron will be able to do what many presidents before said they would do, but didn't succeed, and that is reform the French economy, reform the French labor market, reform the pension system, so that the French, who have, by the way, in the economy, they have lots of startups, there's a lot of potential, but, and especially with the startup movement, they may get away a bit from the problem that the French have, that this is all very much state-oriented and state-directed. So if Macron succeeds to have Germany and France again at eye level, I think that would make it much easier to convince also the Germans to say, okay, we are ready to deepen the monetary union and have a European monetary government, whatever. So we have these kind of projects which I think can work. Also, there's one thing, and then we go to the next issue. One thing is we have a system, we have always had it, and we have to stop that. When something goes bad, we have a tendency to blame Brussels and say this is Brussels. It's Brussels if we had to do the same. But on many cases, those who criticized Brussels before in the council voted for what they now complain about, and they are very happy to. And this is also something we must stop blaming Brussels. At the same time, Brussels sometimes gives reasons for it, as I said in the first place. Now let's turn. If this question satisfies you, perhaps one more topic, and then we turn to the. And this is, of course, the one topic that we have been following very closely: the relationship to Russia. President, during the election campaign, there was a lot of talk about Russian involvement, wiretapping, or having emails then distributed, and then the links of the Trump administration to Russia, and all this. So, where do you think the relationship between the US and Russia will go? Because on the one hand, of course, Russia has its, and we see what they're doing in Ukraine and other places. On the other hand, Russia-US relations have always been very important relations, and many American presidents have resolved world crisis by through their relationship with Russian presidents.
So, candidate Trump made a lot of statements making very clear he wanted to work with Russia. Someone characterized a view, I think at the campaign, I think it's changed. The campaign's view was that President Obama had been tough on Russia and too easy with China. And the proper approach should be we needed to be tougher on China and easier with Russia. I think that was kind of a motif in the campaign. But you see the process of what happens when you go from a candidate to be president. Because though whatever instincts the candidate Trump had, President Trump then had to deal with a very different attitude in the Congress, had to deal with what he was hearing from leaders of various countries, and he has spent a lot of time, to his credit, he has spent a lot of time on the phone and in person meeting with foreign leaders. And he had to deal with the reality of what Russia is doing in the world today that is unconstructive. And it's clearly had an impact. Russia policy is not where people thought it would be now, given the campaign. So where are we now? We have an investigation that is now going through regular order. That is to say, Robert Mueller, former FBI director, has been appointed as a special counsel to the Justice Department. He is going to look into the question, and his remit is to look at ties and coordination between the Trump administration and Russia, and to look at actions that follow directly from that in terms of some of the issues associated with the firing Jim Comey and the like. And he will then report those results. The Senate Intelligence Committee, the House Intelligence Committee have their own independent investigations that are going forward. We know how to do this. This issue now is part of kind of regular order. And the challenge for the White House is to cooperate with those investigations, but not have them overwhelm the White House operation so that the only thing they do is to respond to the two committees and Robert Mueller, which is why you hear them setting up a war room, a very unfortunate term, I think, but a separate staff of lawyers that sort of says, you handle the response to the investigation, and the rest of the White House needs to get busy on dealing with the issues the American people are concerned about. And so hopefully that's the structure we're going to get into. What is the potential impacts? My own sense is, and my wife is a prosecutor, so she should talk about this more intelligently than I, but my own sense is that if there is, and President Trump has begun to frame it this way. In a public statement yesterday, he said, I didn't cooperate or collude with the Russians to throw the election. And none of my campaign staff did, so far as I know. And that's a smart way to frame it, because it means, as to him, that if there was not evidence of collusion, or he did not know, if he did not collude and was not aware of such collusion, he's okay. I think, however, if at this point there is no evidence of such collusion or coordination, so far there's come forward, though a lot of facts have yet to come forward. I think if there is not such evidence, then I think he'll put it behind him. If there is evidence of collusion or coordination between the campaign and the Russians to throw the election, that's another matter, and that is going to be serious indeed. Let's assuming in the end of the day he's able to put this behind them. I think already you will see them start trying to rebuild the relationship with Russia, and some of that is good. U.S. and Russia, for all their ups and downs, have within sort of the last up to 5 years or 3 to 5 years ago had a lot of relationships at various levels in the governments. My understanding is that almost all of them have been severed. That is not smart on an important relationship. So one of the things I think the Trump administration can do now, even while they deal with the investigation, is just get rebuilding some of those ties. Second, I think the Trump administration will try to see whether they can cooperate with Russia in Syria to try to get the civil war down, try to deal with the humanitarian situation, and destroy ISIS. We'll see whether that is possible. I think if they can put the investigation behind them, if they can establish some record of cooperation and pattern of cooperation in Syria, they might try to see whether they can work with the Europeans and be more active in trying to settle the Ukraine issue, which would then open the doors potentially for getting out from under sanctions. But I do not think they will rescind sanctions in advance of that kind of resolution. I don't think politically they can, because I think the Congress of the United States would be all over them and reimpose them quite quickly. That's my guess. But, you know, as I say, my big thematic is they've only been at it 4 months. It's going to be a long transition, and it's hard to know exactly. I think they're not at the point of having settled strategies or even settled policies. I think they're setting the table for strategies and policies. I think that's where we are in the process.
Okay, again, as you advised already on an earlier occasion, we have to have strategic patience. Why don't we turn now to the audience, and we have questions, please. Yes. Why don't you introduce yourself so everybody knows you?
Elizabeth Pond, a journalist and author here in Berlin. I'd like to ask you to think out loud in a little different direction. Let's assume all the op-eds are right that see the leadership of the West now turning from America to a very unhappy Germany to have it thrust upon them. What chances of success do you give them?
Do you want to answer that?
No.
Well, you know, I think being president of the United States is really one of the toughest jobs there is in the world. But I think being chancellor of Germany is pretty up there. And, you know, her task, if she is reelected, is Christoph, I thought, brilliantly laid out the potential challenge and opportunity, because remember, as my former boss, President Bush, used to say, I'd come in to him at 7 o'clock every morning with Josh Bolton, and we would tell him the challenges, which usually meant crises or disasters, that had risen overnight. And we would say, your challenges today. And President Bush would always say, Hadley, inside every challenge, there is an opportunity to advance the interests of the American people, and your job is to go find it. Now get out of here. So Chancellor Merkel will have the challenge and the opportunity to really try to put, you know, Europe and the future of Europe on a firm foundation. To ask her, in addition, to become the leader of the free world on top of that is not going to happen. It's unfair to ask, and I don't think the American apparent step back is going to go to the point of abdication so that will be required. You have seen a reassertion of American leadership in the Middle East. That's what this trip was all about. I was with some people who talked about, well, in Asia, people, because of American disengagement, are going to be looking for an alternative partner. Maybe they'll be looking at China. Well, for most of the countries in the Far East, the person they want a partner against, the reason they want a partner is to help deal with China. How can China be the partner of Japan or South Korea to deal with an emerging China? So, you know, I may be wrong. I think it won't get to the point where Angela Merkel has to both lead Europe and lead the free world at the same time.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, in the back.
I'm doing my best here.
Rikinka is a business lawyer working in the banking sector. Therefore, my question, what is your assessment in terms of capacities? What do you think that the administration is at all capable of doing given the budgetary constraints, given the potential gridlock in Congress, perhaps on several issues to come, given the foreign policy objectives that are not clear yet, given the rise of interest rates, potential rise of interest rates coming up, probably in the US especially, to a certain degree, of course, predicted in the Eurozone as well. At least there are some indications as to what the financial markets are concerned, and given the lack of banking restructuring, especially in the Eurozone. I mean, these are global issues of such a degree that I can't imagine at all a single administration solving. So where do you see, in your view, the American administration? Give it, let's say, in 2 years.
I can't answer that question in 2 years. I can tell you some things to look for. And again, you know, I'm no economist, so others ought to, when we get to the, others ought to feel free to comment on some of these issues. You know, I worry about, you know, the stock market's up, and there's indications that, you know, consumer confidence is up and business confidence is up. I don't see it in the numbers. And, you know, we are not well positioned for another global downturn. You know, we haven't gotten our interest rates up high enough so that you can cut them to stimulate growth. The Fed has this huge, you know, balance sheet, which they have done, and in some sense, the Europeans have done the same thing. So we don't have a lot of ammunition if there is a new global recession in the next year or two. So I worry about that. And that's going to be a challenge, and that will constrain what Trump can do. Secondly, President Trump is going to have to show he can start working with Congress and start racking up some wins on some of these problems. And there are, you know, they tried revisions of Obamacare, or replacement of Obamacare, and that's run into real political problems. I hope they give that some time, restart at some point, and try a bipartisan approach rather than a partisan approach. If there is one opportunity for President Trump, it is to try to do something on a bipartisan basis. The country cannot go forward where Democrats come in and they establish a health care program, Republicans come in, replace that one, establish a Republican health care program, Democrats come in and replace that again. That's not progress. That's going like this. And I think one of the opportunities for him, and I think the U.S. Senate may lead the way where there is a core of Republicans and Democrats that want to work together. I think there's an opportunity if he will try to do some things on a bipartisan basis. I think there are some quick wins. I do think infrastructure is a quick win. Republicans and Democrats want to have a major infrastructure program. We need it, both social and physical infrastructure. Both Trump and Hillary Clinton talked about it. There's an issue about how to finance it, which is a real problem. They ought to work on tax reform, but not quite be as too ambitious about it. Again, because they have this problem of what to do with the impact on the deficit, because President Trump says he's not going to touch Medicaid, Medicare, or Social Security. Sorry, Medicare, Social Security. Unfortunately, he's going to go after Medicaid. Medicare and Social Security. Well, you know, you can't square the circle if you don't do something about entitlements unless you get the kinds of economic growth at the 5 or 6% level, which I just don't see we're going to get. So it's, you know, he has real challenges in terms of going after some of these domestic issues. And my hope is that the economy holds up. He takes a more bipartisan approach. They show some progress on the infrastructure. They make some progress on tax reform. And that at some point they begin to tackle the entitlements program, and we get some more reasonable economic growth. But 2 or 3% isn't going to do it for us. Just can't get there from here. But again, you got to get an economist to give you those answers. But that would be my take.
Sounded very convincing. Again, in the back.
Thank you. Rick Nagelschmidt. I work at the Berlin State Parliament for a member who also deals with security issues. And I'm interested in another angle of the Russia story, which you didn't speak about. And that's the influence on the transatlantic relations. Perhaps you could speak about the development of this under the supposedly Russian strategy of meddling in elections, supporting populist movements, or its strategy of really kind of disrupting Western alliances. And my questions would be if that's you, both of you, view this as really Putin's strategy too, and how to deal with it in order to hold on to the pillars of transatlantic alliances and the future of it. Thank you.
I'm going to start this
Yes.
and frame it up a way, and because I think it's going to be too extreme, and I think you're going to disagree with it. We'll temper it. So I'll do it. So what would be a good day for Vladimir Putin? What's a good day for Vladimir Putin? He wakes up and he learns that U.S. and Europe have a fissure has opened up between the United States and Europe. He's shown that the Article 5 guarantee on NATO is a paper tiger, not real. And the EU breaks up, and Russia basically gets some very sympathetic regimes in some of the Central Eastern European countries. And before you know it, Russia has reestablished a sphere of influence in Central and Eastern Europe. That would be, I think, a great day for Vladimir Putin. I don't think it will happen, and I think that the United States and Europe together are taking some steps that will ensure that it does not happen. But that would be, I think, a good day for Vladimir Putin. I think one of the things, what really motivates him is Russia is back. He wants Russia to be respected, to have a place at the table on the same level as China, the United States, and Europe. And he wants a seat at the table at every major crisis. And he's largely gone a long way towards achieving that objective. He's really been quite successful. The piece of it I'm most worried about, actually, over the long term is when I would have interactions with my counterparts in Russia, particularly in the first term, but even into the second term, they would say to you, look, Putin understands that his historic opportunity is to bring Russia into the West. And he's willing to do that. But you have to let him do it in his own way because there are dark forces in Russia that could be awakened. And these need to be managed. Russia doesn't talk that way anymore. Their view is Russia is an alternative to the West. Lavrov, his foreign minister, talked about moving beyond Western, in a post-Western world. And I think he really believes he is the defender of conservative orthodoxy in the face of a declining West. That's my read. That's a more problematic Russia over the long term. And it's more problematic what it says for the future of Russia under Putin, for those people who want something more democratic. So I think managing Russia is going to be a huge challenge going forward, and I think that neither the United States nor Europe are going to be able to do that successfully on their own. We're going to have to do it together.
I don't question your analysis, quite the contrary. I'm totally of your opinion, and therefore it is so important that transatlantic relations work. And this is one of the issues we were most worried about, that from early news of where the Trump administration would go, that they would make a deal, and during making the deal they say, okay, we give up the Donbass and Crimea, and we settle the scores there, so at the expense of some of these countries. Right. And this has proven wrong. I mean, when you, in the famous speech, or one of the two speeches he gave at NATO, President Trump was very tough on Russia, very tough, very clear, also on Crimea. And so that was, I think this danger, if that ever existed, it was not there. So I think that on Russia we have to see eye to eye. We have to work very closely. We worked with the old administration very closely on Ukraine, trying to not resolve the issue, but at least try to stop that it becomes worse. And we worked very closely together there, and this is what we want to achieve. And there, your patience really is asked, because until now the State Department doesn't have any ASGs who work on Russia, where we can on a daily basis interchange and see what are our next steps. But on the analysis, I see it the same way as you do. There was another one back there to the right, yes. Yeah.
Hi, Ashley, master student at Humboldt University. You said, Mr. Hadley, that people that feel victimized by globalization are right in their beliefs, but are they right in their fear of immigration?
Yes and no. There are people who've lost their jobs. And the latest studies I have seen, and again, I'm not an economist, but and actually there was an interesting statement from the U.S. Trade Representative just yesterday or the day before that was interesting on this point. Basically, what the studies I have seen that said basically maybe 15 to 25% of the job loss is attributable to immigration, if you will, or, I'm sorry, I'm going to get this wrong, is attributable to trade practices, which many people read as the immigration piece, and 75% of it is restructuring and automation and all the rest. The problem is that it looks to them like it's a function of trade more than immigration. And in fact, it's probably much more about business judgments, technology change, and automation than either of those. So the trick is, how do you show sympathy for the concern that there are people who feel stuck, who live in communities where the jobs have gone, who have not seen real incomes go up, and don't feel that their children are going to have a better life than they? How do you show an understanding and expression of that, of their concern? How do you give them some concrete steps to give them an alternative, and at the same time explain to them it isn't about really, it's certainly not about immigration, and it's only marginally about trade. It's about other factors that are changing in the economy, and then help them find a place for themselves in that economy. It's one of the reasons I've been won over to the argument for a major infrastructure program, because I think there are a lot of workers probably in their 50s with 20th century skills who cannot be retrained for 21st century skills. And you need to give them the dignity of a job until they get to the point where they can retire with dignity. Well, infrastructure can put a lot of those people for work. And so, yes, it is social, it's in some sense industrial policy, and we Republicans are supposed to hate industrial policy, but you have to respond to their legitimate sense of despair of their situation and show them a way out. And then you can begin to explain to them that it's not about immigration, it's not really about free trade, it's about a lot of other things, and there's some things that we're doing to address those things. That would be my case to you.
Joschka Fischer?
You explained, I think, in a very convincing way, the Russian anti-Western position, at least in the recent years. Isn't the real problem that part of the new administration, let me call it the Bannon wing, the insurgencies, are thinking in the same way, like the Russians do? And the difference is that Russia is Russia. And America is the leading power of the West. And when you have in the center of American power suddenly such anti-Western ideas, don't you think this is very threatening? You mentioned before that they haven't made up their mind about strategies. I guess it's not true. America first is a strategy, at least a position with far-reaching strategic consequences, if this is the position of the Western leading power, of the global leading power. So what about these strategic challenges in the center of American power? I would be interested to hear.
So I'll give you a start at that. I don't know what America first means. And I don't think, quite frankly, I'm quite serious. And I don't think a lot of the people who use that phrase do either. Does it mean, and I've heard someone say, well, sometimes when you listen to, especially in the campaign president, it's going to be American first, I'm going to defend American interests. Well, what leading politician doesn't tell their people, I'm going to defend American interests, or German interests, or French interests? That's what we all say, and that's what we all do. So I'm sorry, I don't know what America first means. I'm more worried about what's underlying the slogan. You know, President Trump talks about values. I get that. But then, you know, steps away from standing up for freedom and standing up for democracy under the grounds that we don't want him impose on other people's own decisions. That's not the United States. My worry is not the American First slogan. My worry is that if you look at the address that President Trump made to Congress, he said, I'm going to be about American interests. Well, every politician says they're about American interests if they're an American politician, or a German politician says they're about German interests. But he then defines them as protecting America from attack, economic growth, and creating American jobs. Now, that is a very narrow, short-term view of American interests. And it's not the view that of its interests that America has had for the last 70 years, which was a more long-term, and I would say a more enlightened view of American interests. That is to say, working with our European allies to maintain a rules-based international order based on free markets, freedom, and democracy. And we did that at enormous cost for 70 years, and I would argue it brought a period of unprecedented peace and prosperity. That's the conversation I would like to have with President Trump and the people around him. And that's what I am worried is at risk. There are people around President Trump who understand that in their bones. But there are some people around President Trump who reject it and who talk about dismantling the international order. That's my worry. And I think it's one of the reasons why I think it is terribly important for European leaders to come and talk with the administration, President Trump, and people at all levels, and to have this conversation. You know, these values matter. And this international system of values, alliances, and institutions has kept the peace. And one of the reasons we have disorder now is because that system is fraying and is under attack from the new authoritarians and from these transnational threats like ISIS and the like. And we need to come together and have a revised and revitalized rules-based international order. That's the conversation I think we need to be having with this new team and this new administration.
Yes, to the right there.
Good evening. My name is Leopold von Hansen. I go to school here in Berlin. And my question is, what do you think about the circumstance that President Trump really likes to use the two words fake news, and which I find very dangerous? And do you think that there is a chance that this will develop positively in the future?
Do you want to answer that question?
I found it very interesting. This was one of the most striking ones when you had the inauguration, and there were the crowds shown, and then the president said this is the largest inauguration ever, and then it was clear that it was not, but they insisted, and then one of the spokesmen said, well, these are alternative facts that I present you, So I found that amazing. Up to you.
Was that supposed to help? Look, I'm not a fan of this fake news thing. There are a lot of I think it's interesting. I do a lot of news shows, and what's interesting to me is some of the most serious journalists I know are really troubled by what the issue you raised and a whole lot of other issues. And I think the journalistic community needs to do some stepping back and think about what happened in this election and the role the news media played in the election. Because my impression is that it became so clear that it was opposed to Trump and that he was, in their view, unfit to be president, that it had a cost with this new administration and a cost with the American people. You know, for my generation, my wife and I were talking about this, it's Walter Cronkite, right? A lot of you aren't old enough to remember Walter Cronkite. You know, if Walter Cronkite told you something, you could mostly take it to the bank. You know, we don't have that now, and I think our media really went so clearly, took such a position on this election that they gave President Trump an opportunity to talk about fake news as being, this is the news media that always was against me from the beginning and cannot be believed. But secondly, it had an impact on a lot of American people. There is polling that they take, particularly among Trump supporters, and they say, this is what the news media says, and so many, what such percent of the people believe it. And then they say, this is what Trump says. He says it's fake news. And the number of people who believe the news media goes down. And they would believe Trump over the news media. Now that's something that President Trump is exploiting in a way that I would not do. But it's also a problem for the news media, that it has been discredited by a large segment of the population. So I'm not a fan of this fake news campaign, but I also think that the news media really needs to do some soul searching about the role it played in this last campaign. There were a lot of red lines that got crossed. And the problem of crossing red lines is, you know, you really can't get a lot of them back, but we need to do some soul searching because we're heading in a dangerous direction. I think we've exhausted them.
Yes. Well, the New York Times.
One last
is,
one. The New York Times will bring us home.
Responding to this. Alison.
A question from a soul-searching New York Times reporter. And actually, it goes to being about the G20. And we've just seen that the G7 didn't work out so fantastically. We know that Germany has put a great deal of effort into organizing what it hopes will be a successful G20. And you've just talked a little bit about how the community of values that was set up after World War II was so important, but it's fraying. G20 includes some of the people where fingers are pointed towards them, Putin or Erdogan, as being part of the new authoritarians. But at the same time, G20 is held up as a body that could illustrate a way forward as things change more and more in our world. So how do you see it as a body that could manage change, that could be the basis of new fundamentally different strategic structures? It's not clear to me, and I just fear that people who are already confused and disappointed by the state of the world are going to get more disappointed and perhaps disillusioned and wonder why did we have to spend the money to bring everybody to Hamburg and so on.
Well, it's a good question, and the G7 is supposed to be and used to be, and in most of the issues is a very homogeneous body. Actually, it was for the first time in history that the G7 had a conclusion where they were two sides were pitched against each other on climate, and so this was fortunate. On the other hand, the G7, and this holds true for the G20, is a great occasion to have people meet with each other, to talk directly to each other, to have, when you talk directly to each other, you have a much better understanding. And on some of the issues, outside climate. But even on climate, for the president to have all the different arguments, to listen to it, even if he decides now, and he's decided differently. Nevertheless, we didn't have an impact there, but maybe later or on other issues. There were some where President Trump said, this has been a fantastic discussion. I learned a lot, and he was also able to pass his thoughts for others to see it a bit more differentiated. On the G20, you are absolutely right. It's a much more heterogeneous group. It will be much more difficult to come to results. But again, it is very important for the people that are invited to come and sit together. We'll have the first meeting between President Trump and President Putin. So this gives a very good occasion for them to talk to each other. There will be topics on the agenda ranging from health to women empowerment and issues where there are a lot of cooperation and development, and there will be a lot of topics where actually things will move forward. So yes, one always has to question the dimension. Personally, I recall the good old Gimnick-style foreign ministers meeting in the 80s and 90s, where you had European foreign ministers with 1 or 2 advisors, and you had 30 people around the table. And when you hear the numbers of the size of delegations from Russia, US, from Saudi Arabia and others, Japan, going into the thousands, one really wonders. But they are not asked to bring that many. But the dimension of such the dimension is indeed a bit scary, and I would do it differently. The G7 in Elmau was better, I think, but still with 20 countries together. But again, there is a value added. You also, when you see how difficult it is to get the Security Council reformed and more representative, the G20 is a more representative body. Of course, not anywhere close with the legal basis that the United Nations have. But still, for these to come together and talk to each other is a value in itself, and I think it's very important that the meeting does take place.
The first G20 meeting was held under the Bush administration in the aftermath of the 2008 financial and economic crisis, and its purpose was to try to bring countries together and head off a leap into protectionism and beg your neighbor policies. And it achieved that objective. I think it probably was its finest hour, and I think its reputation, people had higher hopes for it. I don't think it's realized those hopes. My sense is it's useful, but it should be limited, and it's economic issues and related issues. It is not an alternative to a rules-based international order. It is not, a caucus within the United Nations. The views are too dissimilar of the group. If we are going to revise and revitalize the rules-based international order that we would all support, it's not going to come out of the G20. So I think it's useful, but you have to focus it on those kinds of issues where it can be useful, and keep your expectations in check. That's what I would say.
So one last question or comment.
I think we're done.
We are done.
Thank you all. This has been great fun.